So first of all, thanks for nominating my paper for whoever decided that. And I should also say that the paper says I will present is a great piece of work. I read that paper, which make myself even more honored to be nominated for that prize. As I was saying before, the scope of the paper changed a little bit due to a review process. Before the version I submitted, it was more like a theory of speculation, how speculation drives the business cycle. Now it's more like a methodological paper, and the theory on how speculation drives the cycle is more of an application of that methodology we developed. So this is joint work with Zach Bijou from UCLA. So the motivation, there is a tradition in asset pricing that links heterogeneous, non-rational heterogeneous beliefs and study its implications for prices, volumes, due to the wealth redistribution among agents. If you add short selling constraints, you get notions of speculation and bubbles, as in the seminal contribution of Everson Krebs. But you do not find many standard macrofinance models linking heterogeneous beliefs and business cycle. There is this paper by Caballero and Simchak, who explores the role of aggregate demand frictions. And there is this paper by these authors who explore the role of incomplete market. What we are going to propose here is a minimal departure from a standard RBC model, and the lens is going to be on the supply side of the economy. The focus is going to be on hours worked, a key driver of cycles, and the key feature we introduce in the model to link heterogeneous beliefs and business cycle is that time to build assumption, in the sense that labor is hired in advance before used in the production. So in our model, labor must be hired one period in advance, and that will link the discounting of the investors, of the investors who hold shares of the representative firm, to labor investment. We are not the first to explore this mechanism. Bob Hall, for instance, in this 2017 AR paper, he shows that if you allow the discounting of the firm to be volatile, you can kind of solve the Scheimer puzzle. Heterogeneous beliefs here regard the future TFP of the representative firm. And as I said, the mechanism will be the following. The investor beliefs will affect the discounting of the firm, which itself will affect labor demand. The contributions of this paper are the following. So we have a paper and pencil model to help us organize idea, to understand how different configurations of beliefs will affect the business cycle. Then you have a quantitative exploration to get a sense on how sizable is the role of heterogeneous beliefs. And finally, I'm going to present the theory of speculation-driven business cycle, which was the core of the version submitted to the meeting. By the way, I'm presenting in English, but please interrupt me if you have any question. If you feel more comfortable to ask in Portuguese, please feel free to ask me also in Portuguese. So the organization of ideas, we are going to focus on 3 business cycle properties: the internal propagation of the cycle, the amplification of fluctuations captured by this moment, the standard deviation of hours, and a notion of path dependence, which is the correlation of the length of the boom and the magnitude of the bust. Here we want to understand if the longer the boom, it will imply a more severe bust. We have 4 types of rational beliefs we're going to explore. The rational beliefs, the rational guy who holds correct beliefs about the economy. The optimistic guy who thinks that good states are always more likely than they really are. The pessimistic who thinks that bad states are always more likely. And extrapolative, who thinks that the bad states are more likely at bad states and good states are more likely at good states. So the extrapolative guy tends to extrapolate whatever states we are right now to the future. And the key feature of heterogeneous beliefs we focus is whether beliefs are rank preserving or rank alternating. To make things clear, think of a combination that you think in a configuration that have an optimistic guy and a pessimistic guy. And in this case, the rank will be preserving. At good states, the optimistic is always more optimistic, and the bad state, the optimistic will be always more pessimistic. Now think if you combine a rational guy and extrapolative guy. At the good state, the extrapolative guy will be more optimistic because he will tend to extrapolate the good state to the future, but at the bad state, he's going to be the pessimistic. He will tend to extrapolate the bad state to the future. So the rank alternates. In one state of the nature, we have one optimistic guy, and yet the other state of the nature, the rank inverts. The other agents is going to be the optimistic.
Dudu, just a clarifying question. The rank preserving, that means that in the bad state, the more pessimistic is more pessimistic. In the good state, the more pessimistic is more also pessimistic. More pessimistic.
Exactly.
In both states, okay.
In both states, exactly. Exactly. And this is going to be important for the properties of the cycle, as I'm going to mention in a bit. So some anticipation of the results. So the first result we have is that belief heterogeneity per se is a source of internal propagation of the cycle. And we came to the conclusion that by assuming some rank alternating beliefs, we get more sensible conclusion. First, we get the path dependence, something that is documented empirically, that the longer the boom, the deeper the bust. We get a somewhat sizable amplification in the calibration. And in the calibration, we are going to discipline the extrapolative investor with diagnostic expectation put forward by Gianaioli, Islifer, and co-authors. I'm going to explain at the calibration part what diagnostic expectations mean. And finally, a third sensible conclusion is that if you couple short selling constraints and limited participation from some agents in this economy, we get the narratives of speculation-driven business cycle and Minsky and Kindelberger. And so if you read Minsky and Kindelberger's books, the story they try to tell along their books in something like that. That's the narrative. You have excess optimism and disagreements leading to speculation. Speculation leads to bubbles in asset price, which are fueled by increased leverage and credit expansion. And once the bubble bursts in Wall Street, the crisis reaches Main Street with a surge in unemployment or with a decrease in hours work. And we are going to show that our RBC model of heterogeneous beliefs, once we extend to account for short selling constraints and limited participation, we can tell this narrative. At least qualitatively, the model is consistent with this narrative.
Dudu, quick question here. So in this model, the business cycles will be asymmetric. So a positive shock will have exactly the same effect of a negative shock, but just in negative sign, or
no, it's going to be asymmetric. And I think I can answer your question in a bit once I present your graph or some graphs.
Okay.
Okay. It's going to be asymmetric. So here, the longer the boom, the deeper the bust. So there is some path dependence that introduces some asymmetry on the effects of the shocks. So let me go through the model. So you have an infinite horizon model. You have a finite number of investors with mass mu I. Here is the problem of the investor. We assume log utility. So the key assumption here is that they hold the heterogeneous beliefs here in blue, and they maximize preferences subject to the budget constraint. And the budget constraint is just the portfolio choice. So he's going to the investor will choose consumption, the amount of shares of the representative firm they want to hold, the amount of risk-free bonds they wanna hold. Q is the price of the bond or the price of the share of the firm. Pi is the dividend of the firm, the profits of the firm that goes to the share owners, and R is a risk-free interest rate that goes to the holder of the risk-free bond. So it's basically a portfolio choice. They have to choose consumption. It's a portfolio problem that aside consumption, they have to choose how to allocate their savings between shares of the representative firm and a risk-free bond. And in extension, we are not going to assume that for the theoretical results, but in an extension, we also impose some short selling constraint on the side of the shares, so we can get speculation and bubbles as in Harrison Crabb seminal contribution. There will be a representative firm that will choose labor one period in advance to maximize the firm value. The exposed profits or dividends are given by that function. So here's production. A is the TFP shock. Labor is the Cobb-Douglas production function, in which labor was chosen in the period T, one period before, and this is the wage bill. We are also
Dudu, why not in the budget constraint? It does not appear labor income, nothing like that.
Okay, because so that is to get, so for two reasons. So we want to provide a paper and pencil model to discuss how heterogeneous beliefs affect the cycle. If we put some disutility of labor here, we would not be able to solve the model in closed form. So that's the first reason. So the first reason is technical. The second reason is economically. We did a segmented market to generate bubbles for a reason I'm going to explain in a bit. So we need to assume a separate agent who doesn't have access to the market for shares, so we can have bubbles. And I'm going to explain, so I can have the speculation-driven business cycle theory, which I'm going to explain by the end of the presentation. So two reasons, technical and to get that economic sensible conclusion to be able to generate the speculation-driven business cycle theory and Minsky and Kindleberg. And I'm going to explain in a bit. So here is the supply of labor. So have a hand-to-mouth. So to get the closed-form solution, we are going to assume a hand-to-mouth worker who chooses labor to maximize its GHH preferences, but we have an extension that we allow the worker to save through bonds, but not through shares. And that budget constraint will be something like that, in which the worker also access the bonds market. And again, the reason is to get the speculation-driven business cycle. I'm going to explain by the end of this presentation. Yes?
If the guy is hand to mouth, it doesn't really matter if it's GHA preference, right?
It's just to generate, yes, totally, but once we consider the extension with limited participation, that assumption will be important.
With this extension, he will not be hand to mouth anymore.
He is not going to be hand to mouth anymore. Exactly. Yes, yes. The GHA preference is just to generate a static supply of labor, so that can be easier to solve in closed form. So have a lot of assumptions to be able to derive a paper and pencil model. And the last simplifying assumption to derive the paper and pencil model is to assume that the TFP shock follows a two-state Markov process with support between a low shock, which is lower than the higher shock. So it's a two-state Markov process, two shocks, and the ambassador I will form beliefs regarding the evolution of TFP. So the heterogeneous belief will create a motive to trade among investors. And we also assume some mixing. We also assume that an investor dive probability delta, such that in the steady state, we can have heterogeneous agents. If you do not assume that, then in the steady state, only the rational guy will survive and will hold the whole wealth in the economy. It be the only guy that determines price. So we have to assume that, to get some heterogeneity of beliefs in steady state. So the remaining market clearing condition for goods, for bonds, so bonds must be in zero net supply, and the shares, the amount of shares is normalized to 1. So now going to the recursive formulation, we have an exogenous state S, and we are going to look for the aggregate state variable denoted by X. I'm going to specify in a bit. So we are going to have, so that's the only part that I introduced this notation. This notation is just to say that in equilibrium, we are going to have a lot of motion, that given the exogenous state, the TFP shock, the endogenous state X, I will specify later, and the realization of the shock, I can map into a set of endogenous states to borrow. And we have those two objects. The first one that I'm going to use throughout this presentation is the risk-free return on bonds that only depends on the state today, the endogenous state today, and the realization of the TFP shock today. So it cannot depend on the realization of the TFP tomorrow, otherwise it wouldn't be risk-free. And also the return on share. So the return on share is the price of the share tomorrow. So here is X prime, is the price of the share tomorrow, plus the dividend the representative firms sends to their owners tomorrow. So pi here is the dividend divided by the price today. And here is the return of the shares given the state X, the state S, and contingent on the realization of the TFP S prime tomorrow. So after solving the problem, so again, as I mentioned, can get a lot of analytical equations in this model. So after solving the investor I problem, we get a stochastic discount factor given by that. I won't have time to explore the meaning of that formula, but I just want to emphasize here that if you go to the Euler equation of the investor, that probability, that subjective probability I in the denominator here will cancel with the subjective probability here. And the Euler equation, once you plug the stochastic discount factor here, will be the same for all agents. So we obtain a kind of unanimous result that despite belief heterogeneity, all stockholders agree on the firm's objective function, so the firm will maximize its firm value. And we also show in the paper that maximizing the firm value is equivalent to solve this problem. So what this problem is saying, let that fancy A be the last period expected TFP. So the firm problem is to maximize its profit. So again, A is the last period expected TFP. Is going to be one of the state variable in the model. Recall that you have to have that time to be assumption. And the law of motion, that A, that's going to be used in the next period maximization problem are given by that, where that PF, which the probability the firm attaches to the realization of the low shock, and PFH is the probability the firm attached to the realization of the high shock. So the expected TFP for the next period is going to be given by that formula. And you show in the paper, that if the firm is called to maximize its firm values on behalf of its stock owners, they will maximize. It's equivalent to maximize the problem once endowing the firm with those subjective probabilities, which is nothing else than the risk neutral probability or the risk adjusted beliefs for those who are familiar with macrofinance, which are going to be the same to all investors. But the important part here in this slide is that we can derive a closed form solution for those firms' probability. It's going to be a function of excess returns. So here in the numerator, it's the negative of the excess return contingent on the realization of the low shock. So it's the return of the share contingent on the realization of the low shock minus the risk-free bond. And the PL here, the probability the firm attaches to the low state, is the expected return of the share of the firm contingent on the realization of the high shock minus the risk-free bond. So the intuition for those equations are the following. So exposed profits are risky. So the investors would like to somehow to insure themselves against that risky outcome. And the higher the overall willingness to bear risk in the economy, the lower is going to be the average excess return, meaning that the term here is high and that term here is low, such that firms' beliefs are distorted, favoring good state. So the more you are willing, the more optimistic you are, the more you are willing to bear risk, the more the firm's beliefs will be distorted, favoring the good states. You are willing to bet in the good state. And we think these formulas are nice because in some sense, the model links the equity premium to labor hour fluctuations. So recall that this fancy A is the last period expected TFP, which is one of the endogenous state variable. We have the firm's problem, we have the hand-to-mouth workers problem, and then you can derive those closed forms for hours fluctuation, for hours employed, and the wage you pay. And finally, we need to define the remaining endogenous state variables, which is going to be the whole distribution of wealth. So define the wealth A of agent I is the wealth they have in shares, and the wealth they have in bonds. And that term here, eta, is going to be the wealth share of agent I. So this must sum to 1. So the set of the endogenous state variables in this economy is the last period TFP shock and the whole distribution of wealth share. And here is our closed form solution. Here is our closed form solution. We showed in the paper that the evolution of the wealth share is going to be given by this formula here. So let me try to convey some intuition. So whoever believed that the state S prime is more likely ex ante, that is, whoever has a probability from transiting from state S to S prime that is high, they will choose portfolio that will perform better in S prime, such that eta will increase next period. So if I think that the state S prime is very likely, I would choose portfolio that will make me rich if that states realize. And that formula captures that. And there's a second formula that we showed that the expected TFP for tomorrow is going to be the lowest root associated with that equation. This is a convoluted formula. What I want to emphasize here is that beliefs will matter for cycles only through well-averaged beliefs and wealth dynamics. So all I need to know the amount of labor today is the wealth average beliefs. So the configuration of beliefs will affect labor only through its wealth average beliefs. To call that eta is the wealth share of agent I. And the dynamics will be given by that equation. Given that wealth average beliefs and given the realization of the shock tomorrow, we are going to have another wealth average beliefs tomorrow that will impact the amount of labor tomorrow. And we also showed in the paper that if the planner has no superior information and respects subjective beliefs, competitive equilibrium is constrained and efficient. So at this stage, for this paper and regarding this model, we don't have any policy prescription. Everything is constrained efficiency. So let me summarize, let me illustrate this closed form solution, exploring some configuration of beliefs. So let me start first with some homogeneous beliefs. So have only one guy who holds the entire wealth, the entire wealth of the economy. So that formula here vanish. So the guy will, it's only one guy. So the labor will be given by this formula here. And here I'm simulating a 4-period recession within a long period of boom. So have two states only. Here at the top is the realization of the good state. Then we have 8 periods of realization of the good state, and then a 4-period realization of the bad state, and then again 8-period realization of the good state. And here I'm plotting the rational belief. So the first thing I want to emphasize is that you don't have any source of internal propagation whatsoever. The labor is stable, contingent on the state, the labor is fixed. If you assume the optimistic guy, you shift the cycle up. If you assume the guy is pessimistic, you shift the cycle down. If you assume the guy is extrapolative, you shift labor up at good states, but down at bad states. Now let's go to the most interesting part of the results is once we assume heterogeneous beliefs. Recall that without heterogeneous beliefs, with homogeneous beliefs, we don't have any internal propagation. So we can isolate the role of heterogeneous beliefs. And let me go direct to the graphs. Let me say what is written here directly here. So first, I'm comparing, I'm considering a configuration in which the rank of beliefs preserves along the cycle. So the optimistic will be always the optimistic, and the pessimistic will be always the optimistic. So as the cycle evolves, as the good states keep realizing, the optimistic guy who bet on the good state will keep accumulating wealth. Since the guy is optimistic, the amount of the optimism in the economy increases over time, so there is more willingness to bear risk, such that excess returns decrease over time. As excess returns decrease over time, labor increase. So with heterogeneous beliefs, we have an internal source of propagation. Now labor increases as the good shock realizes. Once the bad shock realizes, here we have a discrete jump that is not visible through naked eyes. But once the bad shock realizes, as the bad shock realizes, now the pessimistic keeps accumulating wealth, such that the wealth share of the optimistic decrease. So the overall willingness to bear risk in that economy decrease, excess returns increase, and the labor decrease. Now, so that's what happens once you have heterogeneous beliefs in a rank preserving fashion. Now, what I'm going to do, I'm going to postpone the cycle for 4 periods. So the blue line are postponing the cycle for 4 periods. So now we have more time for the optimistic guy to accumulate wealth. So once the crisis reaches, once we have a realization of the bad state, the optimistic guy will be more wealthy, so they are going to influence price in a more disproportional way at the bad state, and then you have a mitigation of the cycle. So the longer, we show that the longer of the boom, the less severe is the bust, which is in contradiction with some empirical evidence. Now let me consider the same set of graphs, but consider some alternating rank beliefs. So now we have a rational extrapolative guy. Recall that at the good state, the rational is the pessimistic and the extrapolative is the optimistic. So as the good states keep evolving, the rational loses wealth because he's keep betting on the bad state that does not realize. As the rational guy keeps losing wealth, the optimistic, who is the extrapolative, keeps accumulating, we have a decrease in excess returns, which itself will generate an increasing amount of labor in this economy. So what's going to happen if we postpone the cycle for 4 periods? If you postpone the cycle for 4 periods, now the wealth, the rational guy will accumulate less wealth. But once the economy transits to the bad state, the rational guy will be the rational guy will be the optimistic, but he's poorer right now. So you have an amplification of the cycle. So once you combine this rank alternating pattern, once you combine a rational and extrapolative guy, we find that the longer the boom, the more severe is the bust. So before I continue, yes.
Sorry to interrupt you. So sorry for coming back to the previous question. So now let's suppose that instead of having a sequence of good shocks, I'm having a sequence of bad shocks. And from what I understood, we still do not have a short selling constraint, right? So it's fully
okay. That we understood your question. Yes, we are right. That's okay. If you have we have a symmetry in the sense that the cycle is different if you have 3 or 4 realization of the shocks. But if you have the mirror part of this, I don't think we have a symmetry.
Okay. And then right. I think when you have a short selling constraint, things are going to become much more complicated. But yeah, I think you're going to that. Thank you.
Yes. So thanks. Thanks. So before going to the quantitative exploration, let me just show some empirical evidence on that rank alternating pattern. So that empirical evidence is not mine, by those authors. And they show that before the COVID crisis, whoever was pessimistic about the stock market before the COVID crisis become relatively optimistic after the COVID crisis, and whoever was pessimistic before the COVID crisis regarding the stock market, they became more, whoever was optimistic before the COVID crisis, they became more pessimistic. So here is some evidence that once a crisis reached, we have some ranking alternating beliefs which motivate us to consider a quantitative exploration with 2 investors, one that is rational and another one that is extrapolative. So the calibration is pretty much standard. The calibration is not a full-blown quantitative exercise. It's just an exploration. So we consider a simple calibration. We showed in the paper that you can get bounds on the amount that labor can fluctuate. So for instance, if we consider an homogeneous beliefs, an homogeneous rational belief economy, that's going to be a lower bound on amplification. And if you consider an economy in which we endow the firm with perfect persistent beliefs, that they think that the low shock will persist forever at the low state, and the high shock will persist forever at the high state, we have an upper bound and amplification. So the maximum that heterogeneous beliefs can amplify the cycle, it's nearly 50%. So to investor, one rational guy is simple. The other one is the diagnostic. We follow the approach from Bordalo, Gianaioli, is Leifer. We use the tools they developed to a run process. We adapt to the Markov chain process. So I'm running out of the time. But the point I want to make here that with a single parameter, they estimate in the data, you can have a situation, you can capture the representative heuristic from Kahneman intervention, in which agents oversample salient types, representative types from limited and selective memory. So with a single parameter, so again, it's a minimal departure from a standard RBC model. With a single parameter, I can introduce heterogeneity in this model. If theta is equal to 0, I recover the rational equilibrium. If theta is more than 0, we can have those heterogeneous beliefs. And we show in the paper that if shocks are persistent, and they are persistent in the calibration, we get extrapolative beliefs. So here we are considering homogeneous beliefs situation in which you have only diagnostic beliefs or extrapolative beliefs. So here is a measure how the probabilities are distorted. So recall that with theta equals 0, we have the rational guys. So 0.9 and 0.75 are the true probability. As theta increase, that's how probability are distorted. And as theta increase, we get close, as those probabilities get close to 1, we get close to this upper bound here of 50%. So everything I'm plotting is relative to the homogeneous rational belief case. Now I'm considering a small deviation from the homogeneous diagnostic beliefs. We assume that we have a newborn rational guy with 1% and that investors die after 5 years. So we are considering here the average lifetime of a hedge fund. So we assume delta is equal to 0.05. And once one interest result we find is that the amplification relative to the homogeneous economy with rational guy is non-monotonic. So as we increase theta, we amplify the labor responses at the good and bad state. But at some point, as we increase too much theta, the diagnostic agents will make so many mistakes that in the steady state, they will hold less wealth. They will hold less wealth and be less important for pricing and firm decisions. So here we have a situation that the diagnostic guys react too much, but they do not represent an important share of the economy. They represent 45%. So, and again, the nice thing about this formulation is that we have a single parameter that Bordallo and Aioli slide for the estimating the data. So at the values they estimate, something between 0.6 and 1, we get the maximum amplification of nearly 30%. The last thing I want to do is the speculation-driven business cycle. So if you allow workers to access the bond market, we derive this fairly general result. This result is fairly general because it holds if you impose short-selling constraints, it holds if you assume that constraints, it holds if for any configuration of beliefs, it holds if you assume Epstein's preferences as long as the international elasticity of substitution is equal to 1, and so on. And that formula will link the price to earning ratio to a measure of external funds available to speculators. So that thing here in the denominator is precisely the amount that the workers save from one period. It's approximately the amount, the flow of saving of the worker that will go to the speculator. So in the data, speculation episodes are usually associated with high price to earning ratios, but in the model, we only get that if that measure here, if that measure here increase over the cycle. Increase of this cycle. So in the model, we're only going to get that if that measure here increase at the good states. And what's the intuition for the result? Suppose you have some speculation that push the price of the share up. Then we are going to have some demand for goods due to the wealth effect. But since the supply is fixed in the very short run, so recall the time to build assumption, the interest rate will have to react to bring demand down. So if you have sufficient elasticity on the supply of funds, in the sense that a small increase in the interest rate triggers a lot of flow of funds from the worker to the investors or the speculators, we are going to have a situation in which speculation are associated with an increase in the price to earning ratio. So to sum up, the supply of funds elasticity will determine which price will absorb speculation. And with that formula, we showed in the paper that you can have a theory of speculation-driven business cycle. So in blue is the model ingredients we need to fit the narrative of the cycles in Minsky and Klubnerberger, and in both are the properties or the features of the narrative in Minsky and Klubnerberger's books on speculation and cycle. So heterogeneous beliefs, I showed that with heterogeneous beliefs, optimistic investors accumulate wealth over boom. So ours reflect an increasingly over optimistic view of the economy. In the presence of short selling constraint and rank alternating belief, speculation and bubble component due to the resell option in Harrison Krebs and Shakeman and Xiong, and with sufficiently elastic external funds to speculators, we have credit expansion and increased leverage, which is another feature in those books that fit optimism and speculation. The counterpart, as in this formula, is an increase in the price to earning ratio, and we also obtain long turnover of shares due to disagreement during the boom bust cycle. So we can have a model that formalize the narrative of cycle and those books. So that's it in the paper. Just 1 minute to summarize, we studied the interaction of heterogeneous beliefs and business cycle. The novelty here is the lens on a particular supply side feature, the time to build assumption. Belief heterogeneity per se is a source of internal propagation. Moreover, configuration of beliefs matter. We showed that we argued that rational and the combination of rational and extrapolative beliefs lead to sensible conclusions. Qualitatively, we obtain the path dependence property. The longer the boom, the deeper the bust, and the speculation-driven business cycles theory. And quantitatively, we get somewhat sizable amplification. So that's the last part of work we need before we write the new version of the paper. And are submitted. It's some data work to bring together professional beliefs or asset price, manager beliefs, and labor decisions to document empirically the key channel, the key mechanism in the paper. I guess I won't have time, but we also have a future agenda to explore optimal policy, quantitative exercise. The idea is that that paper is a methodological paper that will be the backbone for future work. One is study optimal policy, and the other one fully blown quantitative exercise. Thank you very much, and sorry, I 2 minutes I had my time.
Okay, thank you, Dudu. If you have any questions from the audience, I think that's a good time to ask.
2 minutes for. Then I will ask a question. Dudu, some years ago, I saw Schleifer presenting a paper with Genaioli and I don't know who else, but that used these kind of beliefs, that you were using at the end for generating a business cycle. So I think they were motivated by the 2008 crisis, by the long period of house price going up. And I would like to know how your paper relates to that one.
So the key difference is that we have heterogeneous beliefs. So what they do, so they have this notion of diagnostic beliefs that will generate similar conclusions in the same that the cycle is amplified at the boom because people will extrapolate the boom and will be more severe in the bust. What we are showing here that's different is that with heterogeneous beliefs, we have a source of internal propagation per se, and the heterogeneous beliefs with their model, for instance, we cannot accommodate Harrison Krebs' theory of bubbles because they have only homogeneous beliefs. So the key difference is that, and the reason we are using diagnostic agents, the reason we are using diagnostic agents is because they taught us how to discipline it with data. So in other words, our model with homogeneous beliefs and homogeneous diagnostic beliefs will give similar conclusions to their work. Will give us similar conclusions.
Okay, thank you, Dudu. And now we
thank you very much.
Cesar, go ahead.
Okay. I hope you guys can see the slides. If not, let me know. Thanks a lot for the organizers for nominating this paper here to this session, and thanks Dudu for the first talk. It's a tough act to follow. So I'm going to present Slums and Pandemics. It's co-authored with Luis Brotherhood, Thiago, and Danielle, Thiago and Danielle are both in the audience. So this is a COVID paper, one of the 2 million COVID papers that were written this year. I'll tell you why we wrote it in a second. But the thing about the new coronavirus is that it spreads through close contact among people. And among the recommendations is social distancing, avoid crowded places, and things like that. This is a problem in the slums, right? Slums are neighborhoods with very high density of people, poorer individuals that are presumably more affected by socially distanced staying at home and not working. They also have lower access to healthcare in a lot of developing countries like Brazil, which is the data that we're going to use for this paper. And this is a big problem. Over 1 billion people live in slums in the world. So a lot of people are subject to these conditions and have to deal with this new pandemic. So what we're going to do in this paper have 3 parts. The first one is an empirical part that we're going to use the daily location of millions of mobile phones in Brazil to figure out the social distancing in slum neighborhoods versus other neighborhoods. Then we're also going to have a model, a choice theoretic heterogeneous agent, a general equilibrium model. Each of these things are going to be extremely important to understand this question. I'll be clear about it in 2 slides. And then we're going to take this model to the data to analyze the role of slums in the dynamics, the economic and health dynamics of pandemics. And then we can use the model as a laboratory for a bunch of policies, such as lockdown policies, cash transfers, and also some reallocation of medical resources. So that's the plan. In a picture, this is what we want to study, right? So this guy's trying to protect himself in a slum that looks like that behind him, very crowded, high density area. So here is a preview of the results. From the empirical side, as I said, we're going to use daily location of phones in São Paulo and Rio. What we observe from this data is that when the government imposes some NPI, so non-pharmaceutical interventions like lockdowns, not surprisingly, social distancing increases. What's more interesting is that in slums, there's less social distancing. Even though these guys are subject to those conditions, very crowded conditions and stuff, they engage in less social distancing. That translates to more hospitalizations and more deaths among slum residents. We're going to take the model and calibrate to Rio. And through the model, we can see that there are more deaths throughout the pandemic. There are more deaths than the fraction of the population that live in slums. So slum residents overrepresent the number of deaths in the city. Now we can use the model to think of a world, to think of a city of Rio without any slums. So what would happen then? You're going to get similar deaths overall, total deaths, but you're going to get this like reallocation of deaths, if you will. So there are no slums anymore. So you're going to end up having, since the similar deaths is, the death rate is similar, you're going to get more deaths in the richer non-slum neighborhoods. And then we can do policy analysis. Okay, so we can reallocate ICU beds, and that's going to make both groups better off, the ones in slums and the ones without slums. Mild lockdowns mitigate the demand for hospital beds, so they can be interesting. Strict confinement, so very harsh lockdowns, they contain the disease so much that when you open up, it's essentially a delay. So if you let loose after a strict lockdown, then you're gonna get a similar dynamics, and the hospital bed constraint is gonna bind, and the total death rate is gonna be very similar. And we can also take a look at like cash transfers and stuff, like what happened in Brazil. All right, I don't have time for literature review, but let me just say the following. So there are a lot of papers in economics this year that have dealt with COVID-19. I think there are two types of models, like structural models, the ones that take behavior at center stage, and those who don't take more of like an epidemiological version of it. So there's actually a long tradition in economics that goes back to Kramer, pre-RCT Kramer, that was adding, randomized controlled trials, that was adding equilibrium and choice into epidemiological models. There's very little quantitative work. I've worked on it in the context of HIV, but there's like very little. And as I said, there are like fast-growing, econ COVID-19 papers. So we're going to take like this equilibrium and economic and epidemiological world together with like an urban econ type model of the likes that my co-authors Tiago and Daniel have used. This Santos is not me; it's our good friend Marcelo Santos, and also my colleague Pedro Cavalcante Ferreira and co-authors. And our model in particular is similar to another work that I have with Luis and other co-authors. All right, so let me go to the empirics. So we use data by In Loco, which is a startup from Recife. 3/4 of the co-authors in this paper from Recife. So these guys track mobile phones within a 3-meter accuracy, ensuring privacy of the users, and they track about 60 million mobile phones in Brazil. So they gave us data for 3 cities, actually, São Paulo, Rio, and Recife. But we're going to use data for São Paulo and Rio. And what they gave us was the following. They gave us this daily social distance index, which is the percentage of phones that are away from home. That means like half a kilometer away outside their home. And they gave us this daily index from February until late May. So what these guys do is that they divide the cities in these non-overlapping hexagons. So São Paulo is covered by 1,300 hexagons and Rio by 840 hexagons. And then we have this daily social index for each hexagon every day. And then we merge this data, we merge this map that they gave us with the socioeconomic map that comes from the census that tells us, several characteristics within the hexagon. We think about like a small neighborhood, including whether it's a slum area or not. So this is what we find for Rio and São Paulo. So the little black dot is when each city implemented the first NPI. So it's usually a lockdown. And then not surprisingly, you see that the social distancing index goes up in both cities. So this is like, around 30% of cell phones of people who are at home in a given day, and goes up to like 50 or 60% in both cities. Okay. Then what we want to do is the following. We want to compare the hexagons that have slums and the hexagons that don't have slums. So after you impose this non-pharmaceutical intervention, whether the people from the different neighborhoods behave differently. Okay, so our treated group here are the hexagons with at least one house that lives in a slum, but the results are similar if we use the share of slums in the hexagon. So I can show you a table, but I think the graph is better. So this here is the difference, the estimated difference. By the way, we also control for like time and hexagon fixed effects. So this is the difference in social distancing between the slum neighborhoods versus the non-slum neighborhoods over time. Okay, so they were pretty much, take a look at Rio, São Paulo is the same. So these guys were behaving pretty much the same pre-NPI, pre the intervention, pre-lockdown. But then after the lockdown is imposed, we saw that social distancing goes up. but it goes up less in slum neighborhoods. Okay, so 4 to 6% less. Okay, that's true both in Rio and in São Paulo.
Cesar, how should I interpret these numbers? So the magnitude?
So remember, so the social distancing is the fraction of cell phones that are at home in a given day, that do not leave home in a given day. So so here would be like 5-6% of slum residents less stay at home in a given day for all of these days. Does that make sense? Okay. So we have this in a table, but it's the same thing. Another thing that we have is that we can correlate, these are the maps of Rio and São Paulo, for those who don't know, and then we can correlate, the share of slums. We can check whether there are more hospitalizations and or deaths from residents in slums versus not slums. And then we can do that for São Paulo only. Anyway. And then we find that there's more hospitalizations and deaths if you think about COVID specific deaths, or also respiratory diseases that you may have mismeasured the COVID death or hospitalization. Okay, so so that's it for the empiric. So let me go for the model. We want a model in which people make decisions. We are seeing here, so the government told people to stay at home. They did stay at home more, not everybody, but there was a different behavioral change when you compare those in slums versus those in non-slum neighborhoods. So we want to add this choice margin. So that's where economics comes in. But we also want heterogeneous agents, of course, because we have guys that live in slums, guys that don't live in slums. And we also want a general equilibrium model, because if I go outside, I can get sick if I'm healthy, but if I am infected, I can infect others. So there's a clear externality going on in this world, and general equilibrium models are great to model these type of things. So these are the ingredients we want, and the model is this one in a graph. So we're going to have like two types of agents. They're going to differ up here where they live. So the density, the population density of the neighborhood they live. Also the income, slum residents are going to be poorer. Hospital access, slum residents are going to have less access to hospital beds. I'll be more precise about it. And there's also, we add this in that people in slums are usually younger than people outside of slums. And as we all know, there's a big age gradient when it comes to COVID. And we want choice. So there's like this sand clock here to denote what time you spend outside your home working or leisure, or inside the home. That's a choice. Okay. So what these guys can do, so we have the slums guys and the other guys, what they can do is that you can choose some time to stay at home. And if you are at home, you don't interact with anybody at home in our model, so you're safe. But if you go outside, either for time to work or time spent in leisure, there's all of the corona stuff out there, so you can get infected. And as you go outside, these groups mix somewhat. So people in slums can infect people in other neighborhoods and vice versa. And then what's going to happen is that, you start your life as healthy, you venture outside, you can still be healthy if you're lucky enough not to catch the disease. But if you do catch the disease, you may get infected. And if you get infected, you can die or you can recover. I guess it's, we don't argue that being diseased is an absorbing state. Being recovered, whether that's an absorbing state, that's up in the air. So here I'm going to assume that it is an absorbing state. Once you recover, you're going to be immune forever. But we do have an extension in the model that we relax that. So that's the model. Let me show you some equations, but not too many. If you got that, picture, that's the essence of the model. So the models in discrete time have these two different groups, the ones that live in slums or favelas and the other guys. There's this health status, J, so you can be healthy But if you venture outside, you can get infected. If you get infected, you can recover, or you can develop some serious symptoms. If you develop some serious symptoms, you need a hospital bed. If you have access to this hospital bed, you might recover or die, even if you have the access. But if you don't have access, you're going to die for sure, for simplicity. And then if you recover, again, as I said, you're immune forever. Then what's the difference in slums, right? So there's a higher population density that we're going to denote by this psi. These guys are younger, so all of these recovery probabilities or death probabilities, since these in the data tend to be age dependent, because people in slums are younger, they're also going to have, a better probability to recover. They're poorer, so their wage rate here is going to be lower, and they have a harder access to an ICU if they develop the serious symptoms and need it. So their death probability may be higher. As long as the ICU bed constraint doesn't bind, it's the same for both. But if you don't have access, you might die with a higher probability. So this differential access to hospitals matter for the death probability among the two groups. All right, so what does these guys choose to do? Remember the little sand clock. They have time that they choose to divide between the work time and leisure time outside L and leisure at home D. Note that all the work is done outside, okay? Leisure outside, this L is the number of hours you spend at the bar, and D is the number of hours that you spend at home watching Netflix. Once you go outside, why do you spend some leisure outside? Because you like these goods, these amenities that you produce by using that time L, and some goods that you buy X. Okay, so I enjoy things. So you're going to see the utility function here. This A is going to show up in my utility function. So I enjoy this A if I go to the bar and spend some time there and I buy some beer. Okay, so if I buy beer and don't spend some time, I don't like it. If I spend some time at the bar but I don't drink, I don't like it. My utility function, I get this consumption that's not necessarily the one outside, like food that I'm eating at home. This A thing that I just explained. Forget about this orange stuff for now, the time that I spend at home watching Netflix. And B here is the over and above consumption, okay? It's the utility that you get from just being alive. If you end up dying, you give up this B, okay? So people don't want to die. This B here guarantees that people don't want to die in the model. So what are these orange lambdas? So this controls the marginal utility of you staying at home, right? So there are two lambdas here. The first one, lambda J, remember that J is your health status. So what we add here is that if you are infected, this lambda J is higher than when you're healthy. So this represents some form of altruism. Okay, so if you are infected, you want to stay at home to protect others. If we didn't have that, if you're infected, throw a party, go outside, go nuts, because you cannot get infected twice. So this controls this altruism. And this lambda P here, P is for policy. So if we are doing, for instance, some lockdowns, some confinements, the planner, the policy parameter is going to be this guy here. We're going to jack up this guy to induce you to stay at home. People discount the future with discount factor beta. In the budget constraint, consumption, the X thing, the beer that you get in the bar. And then, WG, remember, this is your wage. It depends on your group because the slum guys are poor. N is your choice of work up here. In WP, again, P policy, this is from some cash transfer. Okay, so if the government wants to, people want to go outside to work, right? The more they stay at home and don't work, marginal utility of consumption start going up. In order to induce people to stay at home, the government might want to transfer some money. All right, infections. How can you catch COVID? So remember from the little graph that you can catch COVID if you go outside to work in or to the bar, L. So the more time you spend outside, the more likely you are to catch the disease. And this big pi TG here represents the overall infectiousness out there. Okay, if there's absolutely no one infected out there, you know, this big pi is 0. You can go outside as long as you want. You're not going to get infected. So what is this big pi? It's almost the pi hat. I'll tell you what the difference is. So how is the world infectious, right? Well, the world is risky if there are people that are infected out there, right? So if, you know, there are infected people out there or people with symptoms out there, you know, these are their measure, this MT here, you know, the more infected people are out there, the riskier the world is out there. But if there are a lot of people infected, but they don't go outside, it doesn't matter. I'll never meet them. So the infectiousness is about the fraction of people that are infected times the amount of time they spend outside. The chance that I get to find someone outside, okay? All right, now, let me go back for a second. Remember this graph here, there's some intersection in the time that we spend outside slums and others. So how do we model this? So if you look at the first line, you know, we're summing over all groups, F, favelas, and others. So all groups. So this Zeta here, this controls the mixing across the two groups. Okay, if Zeta is 0, the world is completely mixed. If Zeta is 1, the world is completely segregated. A guy from the slum never meets a guy from outside the slums. So you can see that the second line, I don't sum over the entire groups, it's the same group. My group here, G, the same group here on the right-hand side, okay? All right, now, if I'm in my group, if I don't, you know, if I'm in Rocinha but not in Leblon, okay, that area is very high density because it's smaller, right? It's smaller given the population. So how do we measure that density with this psi here? Okay, so psi is kind of like the area. So 1 over the area is the density. Okay, so this parameter here controls the density of the neighborhood. And you know, if you stare at this, you can see that writing linearly like this, I count if you get infected twice, which doesn't make a lot of sense. If you catch it once, it doesn't matter if someone coughs it in your face twice. So this continuous time aggregation takes care of that. All right, I'm going to skip the value functions. All right, what about the access to healthcare, right? So I said that it's differential. So actually, to give you a sense, in Rio, we're going to calibrate the model to Rio. So in Rio, there are 3,500 ICU beds. 3,000 of those beds are in the private hospital network, and 500 are in the hospital bed network. However, only 15% of the population has health insurance. So it's very different, this access to healthcare. So what's the fraction of users in the public network? We assume that everyone that lives in a slum, in a favela, goes to the public. And the other guys, the ones that don't live in a favela, a fraction psi has health insurance and go to the private network, and 1 minus psi go to the public network, okay? So I'm not gonna go through this equations here, but it's just like adding up such that, you know, you get these group specific death rates because the ICU beds might be at capacity, okay? All right, to close the model, output.
Sorry, Cesar, because this is important. Where do you model that because you know that in Rio it happens a congestion, in São Paulo it didn't happen, and I think so. This congestion is important. Could you capture this in your model or not?
Yes, right. So I have here the number of users in the public network. For the public network is the one that's gonna reach capacity sooner, right? Because it's smaller. So you have the number of users in the public network. That's the UPub. Okay. Mm-hmm. Then if I go to look at, for example, no one in a favela has health insurance in a model. So if I look at the death probability for a guy in a favela, that's the delta F. Okay. So if the guy has access, so big Z here is the capacity of the publicly provided hospitals. Okay.
Yeah.
So if the user is smaller than the number of beds, then this guy has a better chance of surviving, and vice versa. Okay, so if the guy, if the state, if there's a capacity constraint, some people are not going to have access to that bed, and they're going to die faster. How do we allocate that? Conditional on the group, randomly. Okay. Now, if you are from another neighborhood, if you're not from a favela, if you have health insurance, that's the psi here, then you face the same constraints, but in the private network, that's much bigger. If you don't have health insurance, you are in the same pool as a guy in a favela. Okay?
Okay.
All right. So to close the
Cesar,
model...
Can I ask you just one question before it's related from the infection probability? So it seems for a guy from Leblon, it doesn't care whether the guy from favela is working or just going to the beach, right? So for him, it doesn't matter.
Yes.
But do we have a sense whether these two groups interact in leisure time or in work time or in leisure work time?
That is a great question. We don't know that. So we looked at time use survey. So there's very, very little information on time use in Brazil. Okay. So Thiago, my co-author, was looking at stuff from PNAD, from it's very, very, very little. And this is actually important, right? Because I'm adding these things up, and what is the Zeta desegregation parameter here? Okay. So what we're going to assume in the calibration is that this Zeta here is going to be proportional to the fraction of work time. So the assumption is going to be, if you work, if you go to a fancy restaurant, your waiter might live in a favela and you interact, but the leisure time would be separate and segregated. So, so even when Dudu goes to Maracanã, he goes to a lounge, and he doesn't interact with people that sit on the side of the sun. That's the assumption. But it's just because we don't have data. Okay. All right. So output is what everyone produces. Laws of motion is what you would expect them to be. Okay. And we solve for a rational expectations equilibrium. Okay. So we need to mesh a bunch of we need to discipline a bunch of parameters. I'm not going to show you to them, but what we target, the fraction of the population who live in slums, the population density in slums versus not slum area. So if you're curious, a slum is 4.5% more denser than non-slum. The guy in the slum makes about a quarter of a guy that is outside. R0, for those who don't know, R0 is, imagine a world where everyone is healthy and you throw one sick guy in there. How many people is that sick guy going to infect? So we target something that's close to what people have estimated. Anyway, let me skip this because I don't have a lot of time. The point is that, we match the data, okay? All right. So this is the benchmark, the baseline results. The x-axis is...
So you said that you have data for Rio and São Paulo. Which data you use to match?
This is Rio. This is Rio.
Okay. You would be interesting to do it separately, both, and to compare the results.
We thought about it. It's very easy to do, of course. I mean, we thought about it. It's just that the paper was too long already. But yes, of course, we can do it.
Because the mortality rate in Rio was much higher than in São Paulo.
So one thing that I can tell is that the fraction of population in Rio that lives in slums is 22%. The ones in São Paulo is 15%. You'll see in 2 slides that might explain some of it.
Yeah, but I think probably is the ICU, the constraint. Sure. The ICU in Rio was much tighter than São Paulo. Probably what's driving.
Actually, I don't have the ICU numbers here. But anyway, yes, we have data on that as well. And yes, Rio is worse. Rio is worse as in like there are fewer ICU beds and they're more tilted towards the private network than São Paulo. So both of these things in terms of ICU beds. But yeah, we can do that and that's very easy to do. All right, so this is the benchmark result. So these are weeks. And the comparison here is that the dashed line is an epidemiological model and the solid line is my model. What is an epidemiological model? An epidemiological model is one in which people don't make decisions. The disease is out there, you behave the same way. You still go outside in the exact same way, okay? So not surprisingly, you know, there are much fewer people, much fewer people that die in the solid world, right, than in the dash world because people respond to these incentives. Okay, a lot less people get infected once you take behavior choice into account, and it's a big deal. Okay, but if you look at the fraction that die, you know, slums are represented with the blue lines. So the gap between the epidemiological world and the choice, the behavioral world, is much smaller among slum residents than among the other guys. The reason is that the other guys, you know, stay at home, socially distanced in the model a lot more than the ones in the slums, which is exactly what we saw in the empirics. I'll get back to that in 2 slides. And then what we see is that, you know, as these guys socially distance and stay at home, you know, they don't go outside, they don't work, so GDP takes a hit here. Takes a hit. So there's a demand side reason and a supply side reason. The supply side reason is I don't go to work because it's very scary out there for me to work. The demand side reason is I don't buy the beer in the bar anymore. Okay, so we have these 2 sides in the model. Anyway. So GDP takes a hit here. Okay, so in the peak of the disease is the trough of the recession. This is about a 40% drop in GDP. Okay, in Rio. So is that close to what we saw in Rio? You know, we don't have GDP measures for Rio, but here we have transactions from credit cards and debit cards from a bank. I don't know if I can tell you what the bank is. Maybe my co-authors know that, but you know, it's a big bank in Brazil. Maybe I can tell you, I don't know. And so this is 2019, okay, the blue line, and the red line is 2020. And then you see, you know, there's a big hit right after the first NPI, and it's actually about 40 percentage points. So it's similar to what the models generate. Okay, now I told you, why do we have the gap between slum dwellers, slum residents, and the residents in other neighborhoods? I told you, you know, the guys from the slums, they socially distance less. So you can take a look here at the time at home, you know, both of them increase, both of them take precautions, but the slum guys, the blue guys, are lower than the other guys. Okay, you can see that the time at work goes down more for the other neighborhood guys. Same thing with leisure especially, right? So we can actually compare these 2 things, right? The time at home, and this is similar to the regression I showed you, the event studies I showed you, right? So this is, Tomas asked me, right? So how should I interpret that number? I said, look, so about 5% of people are staying at home. You know, the model generates something like, you know, 8 to 10. So it's a little bit more. Now, even in Rio, there was some lockdown going on, right? So I'll show you how this graph looks like when we add a lockdown, okay? All right, so this is a lot of numbers. And just to give you a sense, you know, I was telling you, behavior really matters. So these the 2 columns that lit up here, you know, it's the epidemiological and the benchmark. So you can see that a lot more people would die here. A lot more people would die. So 15 for every 1,000 people would die in a world that they don't change their behavior, but only 7 in every 1,000 actually die because people protect themselves. You can see them protecting themselves when you look at the hours at home, it goes up, Okay, hours at home goes up for both, but it goes up more by the other guys, not the slum guys. And you can see also the deaths. I showed you that in the graph. Death goes down more by the other guys than the slum guys. Okay. Now, what would happen if Rio didn't have any slums? Okay, so slums, we're seeing here, more people die in slums. What will happen in a world without slums? Well, the total death rate is pretty similar. But since you don't have these guys in slums anymore, it's the guys from the other neighborhoods that end up dying more. And the reason why that happens is because, in this benchmark world in which we don't have a vaccine, this pandemic is going to end when we reach herd immunity. And since in the benchmark, a big chunk of the herd immunity is being achieved by the guy in the slums and they're not around anymore, the Leblon people need to carry their weight. Okay, so that's in a nutshell what's going on. I don't have a lot of time, but we can decompose, right? I told you that there are a lot of differences between residents in slums and in other neighborhoods, like different densities, population densities of the neighborhoods where they live. They're poorer, the wage rates, and also the age structure. We can decompose all of that. What I can tell is that, just the structure of the city, so measured here by the population density, matters a lot, okay? And you always get this kind of like redistribution of deaths. When you improve one group, you end up hurting the other. The idea is the same as I explained here in the no slums, okay? So if you improve the lives of the of the slum guys, like we do here by moving them to lower population density places, you end up hurting the other guys. All right. So I don't have a lot of time left, 3 or 4 minutes. So let me tell you a little bit about some policy experiments that we run with this model. So I think there are 2 things that you can get out of the model, right? One is to understand what's going on, the health and economic dynamics that are behind, the pandemic here, and how these 2 groups and 2 neighborhoods interact. And hopefully this was clear from the previous graphs in this. The other thing we can do with the model is to use the model as a laboratory to explore different policies. And the first one that I'm going to show you is, what if we reallocate ICU beds? So I told you that most of the ICU beds in Rio are in the private hospital networks. What if we reallocate that? What if we create a single pool of ICU beds, and whoever needs them, doesn't matter whether it's a private or a public bed, can go there, okay? So here it is, we make all beds public. Then the first thing that you see is that the death rates go down substantially from 0.7% to 0.5%. This helps both groups, but of course, the slum residents disproportionately, okay? And you even end up with more people being infected, right? So 47% was the immune guys in the long run. That number goes up to 50%, and still the number of deaths goes down. And that goes back to Bonomo's question when he was asking about the capacity constraints in hospital beds. That's exactly what explains this result. And I haven't talked much about it, but here, this value here, this is actually welfare, just in utils. This is a purely ordinal number here, but this is a policy that actually benefits everybody, okay, both groups. Why? Because there are a lot of people in non-slum neighborhoods that don't have access to the private network either. Okay. All right. So this is a lockdown. Okay. In the paper we have tons of lockdowns. I have a table here with tons of lockdowns. Honest to God. Anyway, whatever. So what happens with the lockdown? So this is a lockdown that lasts for 6 months. Okay. So you can see here. No, I didn't add that. Here it is. So you can see that the lockdown here with the time at home, right? So there's this time at home here that goes up. This first peak here, that's the lockdown. But then we let the lockdown go, and then people start going outside. But then endogenously they move back, inside home because the disease gets worse. So you can see here that when you look at the measure infected, there are 2 peaks. Okay, the first peak here that happens even inside the lockdown, and a second peak that happens after you lift the lockdown. You also see, a a double dip recession. The first one is the lockdown. The second one is the endogenous response. Okay. And then
sorry, Cesar, the people have a perfect foresighting or something like that. So this is the deterministic model, I imagine. Yes. Why do you have the second wave?
Why do you have the second wave?
Yeah, why they relax too much and then they...
Yeah, so this lockdown here is not a particularly strict lockdown. So the dashed line here is the benchmark, okay? So in the lockdown, which is the solid line, you can see that the measure of infected is much lower than in the benchmark, right? What is going on here? The lockdown, by keeping people socially distanced, it brings the disease down, okay? So we contain the disease, we flatten the curve for a while, okay? But then when I lift the lockdown, okay, because we haven't reached herd immunity yet, because the vaccine hasn't arrived yet, then the disease starts to spread again. That's why you get the second blip here, okay? As you get the second blip, people endogenously respond and they socially distance somewhat, not as much as in the first peak that was higher and the lockdown was present, but you get the second peak.
I think it's a coordination problem. Now I understand.
If I had a stricter lockdown, I could get the peaks to look remarkably similar. I could even have the second peak to be much higher than the first peak, as in Europe right now. Okay, we have that in the paper. Okay. And that it translates to, you know, a double dip recession as well. So just the second to last thing I'm going to tell you is that, you know, with the lockdown here, you see that, you know, the relative time at home, you know, it's like 4 to 6%. So this is actually very, very close to what we estimated with our mobile phone data. So I don't have time to go through any more policies. Let me just summarize. So slums are very high density areas populated by poorer younger individuals. And this doesn't line up well with diseases such as COVID-19 that spreads really fast in these situations in high density areas. So what we do in this paper is that we use this rich daily location data, and we show that in slums, people socially distance less, even though, you know, it's worse for them to be, you know, going around, but they socially distance less. Why? They're poor. Marginal utility is very high. These guys cannot afford to stay at home. So we build a model, and through the lens of the model, find, you know, more infections and deaths in slums. A world without slums actually create these distributional health effects. So I told you about two of the policies. Let me just mention about the cash transfer that I didn't have time to talk to you about. But imagine a cash transfer that goes only to the slum residents, the poorer guys. This can even backfire, okay? Because those guys stay at home more, and those are the guys that contributed more to herd immunity, and you can end up actually, you get this redistribution again, and you can end up actually having more deaths, even though, you know, because of this redistribution, you clearly benefit one group versus the other, okay? But unless a vaccine comes along, shelter home, cash transfers, they mostly delay the pandemic, which again, might be good if a vaccine is coming along. So that's it. Sorry for taking 2 extra minutes. That's it. Thanks.
I think we have time for one question. Again, if nobody will ask, I will ask. Look at if I look well at your table, you have in fact a higher death rate for. I know that you are going to explain this by herd immunity now. in this outside the slums than in slums, but your model predicts not the same. It predicts a higher death rate at slums.
You're talking about a world in which I don't have slums?
No, I'm talking about table 3. Only if I interpret the death rate
in the paper. What's the title?
the baseline results.
Okay, that's the table, yes.
Yes, that's the table. So when you look here, the death rate in the slum is, okay, is 10, in the real world is 13. Other is 6 in your model, and the epidemiological is the data, no? The second column.
No. Epidemiological is a world in which, my model is a world in which people don't change their behavior.
Okay.
So
what the data? In the data? The data, what is that?
Because the pandemic didn't end, hasn't ended yet. So this is throughout the entire, this is the long run. This is the entire pandemic.
Okay,
I don't have
but you
that.
don't have any comparison with the data.
For this, no, I'm only gonna have this a few years from now.
No, but you would have.
I can look. I can stop whenever you want here, right? So, for instance, if we look, 6 months down the road, that's more or less about here. So deaths in the slums would be, maybe 30 to 40% higher than outside slums. So this would be a world, right? So I guess 40 weeks is 9 months, right? That's how long a pregnancy lasts. So this would be more or less now. So you'd get something like, the death rates in the slum would be something like 40% higher or something, maybe a little less.
No, yes, but what's the data?
I don't have the data. I from the top of my head, I don't have the data. What I can tell you from the data is that this number is higher. But this,
I know there is demographics too. Demographics in the slums, people are younger. It's not. You have to correct.
We do take that into account.
Yeah.
So in the data for São Paulo, which is not different, would be something like, I don't know if this 10% is not directly comparable, but the one that I have right here would be 10% for real, maybe would be higher. So maybe I'm going to take an educated guess here, but so maybe in the data would be something like 15, 20%. And the model, this is the model, by the way, this is the model without any intervention whatsoever. This is laissez-faire, okay? Yeah. So the model will give something like 40% gap. Maybe in the data will be 20%. But again, you want to look at this, right? So this is laissez-faire. The data was full of different policies. So it would be a hard comparison to make.
Yes.
That's why we need a model. That's why we need a model.
Just a quick question here on the preferences. So I guess that's of course it's what you can do, but how should I interpret the preferences that I suppose you calibrate with expenditure data, time used from before the pandemic, and now the consumption bundle that we have during the pandemic, it's completely different, or how can you extrapolate so far, and how should we think about that?
That is a good question. So these preference parameters are calibrated for a no disease steady state, right? And what I can tell you is that I don't have the graphs here, but in Brazil, you don't have consumption data for like different types of goods and things like that, right? But there is a paper that compares the Sweden and Denmark, because Denmark was much more strict in terms of their policies versus Sweden that was much more relaxed, and the change in their consumption expenditure was actually pretty close. Okay, and they actually have data on consumption that you make outside, like restaurants and things like that. So think about, so that would translate into my X.
Yeah.
Right. So the magnitude is pretty close. That's what I can tell you.
Yeah, okay. No, I guess I've seen papers using, this restaurant reservation data, these sort of things. I guess, yeah, that's what you can do, right? It's
exactly.
It's
so our comparison was, but yeah, yes.
I think, Cesar,
if I may, same thing.
If I may, I think there is a composition effect even in our model, right? which is basically you started not, consuming more of some of these goods. You consume, for instance, more D, which you can think about, say, home production or home leisure. So there is kind of a change also within the model, a composition effect.
Exactly. Exactly. That's what I meant. Like, this change in X here would translate into this outside consumption, and we are in the same ballpark.
Okay. Thank you very much, everybody. Cesar and Dudu and everybody.
Just to, Bonomo, just to say that we have Hugo Hoppenheim and Jeremy Greenwood, hopefully to see everyone there.
Okay. When is it going to happen? So
it's going to be 16:45 São Paulo time. Okay, so 4:45.
4:45. Ok.
Estarei lá, Thiago.
Valeu, Dudu. Parabéns aí. Valeu.
A gente tem que fazer alguma coisa ainda ou é isso?
Acho que já pode encerrar a sessão.
Só um segundo, Tomás, só o PC da pergunta durante os choques são assimétricos, sim, porque depende de onde você começa na riqueza, tá? Então você tem uma sequência de choques ruins, tá? Então os choques são assimétricos, sim, como lembrei, eu falei que não, tá? Mas eu só... Tá
bom. Eu tinha outra pergunta também, mas aí eu escrevo depois umas coisas que eu pensei aqui no meio também. Mas valeu.
Beleza, gente. Valeu, abraço.
Valeu, até mais.
Valeu.